Um, Let me make this analysis in light of constitutional debate vis-a-vis the challenges that Uganda finds itself in today. I have heard from a number of people, and rightly so, in light of the allegiance, that they exhibit towards their kings, the likes of the king of Uganda, for example, the king of Busoga, for example, Toro, Bunyoro, and the likes. But some of the misconceptions that we find ourselves in light of the constitutional debate that ensues around these particular entities, is a failure for one to understand that these individuals, although rightly called kings, have been relegated to a much lesser role because of the mistakes, I'll use that word mistakes in quotes, of the mistakes that were done particularly by them, but also perhaps because they were convinced to do so because of the colonial interests that played against them. You ask yourself why individuals, for example, refer to His Excellency, who is the President of the Republic, as what? As the father. You heard what certain individuals were recalling him the father, and then referred to the son as the son, and then the Holy Spirit was the people. You may excuse such individuals, not because they do not literally understand the implications of those words, but because of the political status that has played in Uganda constitutionally, but also in terms of the socio-economic paradigms, if you like. And also religion, for example, when we see how religion plays itself, religion in terms of the constitutional paradigm, you also may understand why these individuals refer to His Excellency, for example, or particularly a head of the Republic in that context. You see, for you to understand the usurpation of powers that took place, you may want to look at the book called Exhausting, or The Inexhaustible Buganda Ghost, written by Isaac Christopher Lubogo. And some of the things, particularly chapter 3, Lubogo comes out with this discussion of how Uganda, particularly in light of the 1900 agreement, actually surrendered or sold its birthright in a way. Talk about Esau selling his birthright, to his younger brother, and that was a sweep that took over. You see, when the white man comes here, what the Africans failed to understand was that he did not come particularly because he was so much in love with you, the black man. He did not come because he was so much interested in giving you peace. His desire from the word go was territorial expansion, exploitation, in terms of the minerals, but also in terms of cheap labor. Cheap labor in a sense that the African, by DNA, by nature, has that unique God-given strength imbued in them. You will see them eminently in sports and the likes, how they excel in terms of the sports, and extracurricular activities that involve a lot of muscle, not that they are devoid of intellect, but particularly because they have these unique bodies that are so strong and able to do most of these works. The ordinary call them casual works, and so the white man was able to have discovered that. And by my use of the word white, I have to be excused. I'm not being racist in any way. I'm just trying to use that in a context. Perhaps I should use the word the colonial master, talk about people who refer to Germany as Nazi Germany. They make a distinction between Germany and Nazi Germany. So let me look at that word in that context in terms of the colonial master. The colonial master, or the colonies in this particular aspect, was not interested, quote unquote, in the well-being per se of the black man or the African for that purpose. His intention from the word go was very clear. His intention was subjugation. His intention was territorial expansion. His intention was to extend his superiority complex in light of subjugating or taking over Africa per se. No wonder we have that debate in light of the conferences that took place, where the Berlin conferences, where they are arguing in terms of the scramble and partition of Africa, where they are trying to sit down and argue and say, okay, who takes what and for what reason. So you must understand that when we refer to our kings, and I'm using that word loosely, our kings, because then you probably ask me and say, then what makes a king? A king probably presides over a territory, over a set of people, call them a community of people. He has authority, over his people, whether economic authority or military authority, in terms of dominance, you can call that. But when you see the coming of the colonialists, the intention, especially by virtue of the order in council vis-a-vis the 1900 agreement, the black man finds himself, particularly in the context of Uganda, finds himself having sold their rights now to the colonial master. And this is eminent in the 1900 agreement. You look at the 1900 agreement, word per word, you're able to understand that all the problems of Uganda per se, because I'm speaking from that narrative, are really a result, an offshoot of the failure to understand the implications of 1900 agreement. Because in this agreement, for the first time, we see a surrender of authority. Here are a people who, in the context of Buganda, because the Buganda had a centralized system, the Bunyoros had an expansive system in a sense that they were also, well organized in East and Central Africa, but particularly for Buganda, a white man comes in with the context of understanding that Buganda was highly organized, and this is an entity that had actually lived for over 800 years. So it has an authority, a central authority, in the form of the Kabaka, who had his army, for example, talk about them having the biggest army in the Inter-Kastan area, possibly the best naval army in that context. But now here comes the colonial master with this ideology that, wait a minute, I have this magic with me, and the magic is in form of advanced, knowledge in the context of ammunition, for example, and even things like mirrors. And when these items are played over to, a country or a people like Buganda with a weakness. Now the Buganda weakness was because they had an expansion tendency. They wanted to be bigger than the 3 counties that they had initially. And so the white man is able, or the colonial master is able to manipulate that weakness to the detriment of the Baganda as an entity, but also use it to his advantage or to her advantage. And so you see a problem. This problem is generated because of the lack of the black man or the African in this context to understand that, wait, this individual is really not interested in me. He's interested in their own well-being. I would make an analysis in the context of the innocence of the black man in inviting or welcoming the white man was not because the black man in this context was actually dense or devoid of intellectual prowess, but because of his goodness in nature. He was able to welcome the colonial master with open hands. Yes, and those who seemed to be suspicious or who took the colonial master with a pinch of salt were actually dealt away. Talk about Kabarega, and Mwanga, for example. So the 1900 agreement is the first semblance of an instrument that really removes any authority from these individuals, call them the kings, and that becomes a very big problem for us. Today, we see individuals who, rightly so, have a lot of affection towards their kings because of the cultural ties. Talk about the king of Uganda. I'll talk about the Busoga because for it now is another unique one. Little did they know that for the first time, although, quote unquote, the Kabaka, sitting Kabaka or reigning Kabaka, their child, by will or by desire of the king, would perhaps be the people to come onto the next throne by virtue of inheritance, still this is made subject of the Luchiko, which was never the case. So we see the Luchiko, by virtue of the 1900 agreement, for the first time, acting as a sieve, if you like. They are saying, yes, you Kabaka, you have the authority to name who the next Kabaka will be, but we will still have to go through the Luchiko. And who is the Luchiko? The Luchiko for the first time is a legislative body, yes, which was there, but also, quote unquote, which was subject to the interest of the colonial master by then, And we see, for example, the election of the Katikiro, as opposed to being nominated, for example. All these things are underscored into the context now, the big machinery of what the colonialist is using now to completely undo the authority of this so-called king and giving him, to use the phrase of the popularly known as Biyabianswa, So for the first time, we see that even the Luchiko can agree or disagree with the nomination that the king has actually made in light of, an inheritance of sorts, or heirship of sorts. So that's a big challenge. Here is an individual, for the first time, who owned the entire world in the context of Uganda. Yeah? Here is an individual now who cannot even collect taxes. Here is an individual who has no army, yet he had a standing army. Here is an individual who cannot even, order, particular electoral changes, for example. And so he's stripped of that authority by virtue of the 1900 agreement. And that is the dilemma. That is the dilemma that we have today. So when we see a person who actually inherited the colonial machinery reflected in by virtue of the 1962 Constitution, yes, and the 1966, we see a challenge here. We see an inheritance. So we see a republic being an inheritance of the colonial machinery. And for the first time, when that machinery is seen to conflict with this stature of the so-called traditional setup that had been there for time immemorial, we see a direct conflict by way of the Kabaka crisis that ensued after that. Because now there's a conflict. We see Mutesa, for example, finding himself in a complex web. He is the president of the republic. At the same time, he is the king of Buganda. And we see the prime minister, Dr. Apollo Bote. So who has the authority? Who has the authority, for example, when there is a public gathering and it's maybe call it Independence Day or call it another day, and the police band is supposed to play? Does it go and play to the Kabaka's birthday, or does it have to go and, orchestrate over Dr. Paul Mitton's, government procedures that are taking place on that particular time? These are the challenges that we have. For even the Basoga, it is even worse, because you see, Basogas is a constituency of different organized groups, organs, if you like, which were presided over by independent chiefs. And this amalgamation, or this collection of these different entities, now form one person who has to be elected amongst those hereditary chiefs. So Busoga, even when you read the book of History of Busoga by Y.K. Luboko, you will understand that Busoga did not actually have a king. They had chiefdoms presided over by chiefs. And these chiefdoms, for purposes of organization ability, by this other element, the element I told you, the machinery, the colonial machinery, because the colonists said, we want to take hold of Uganda per se, but how do we do it? We cannot keep going and talking to all the different chiefs. Let's have one entity like the Bagandas have amongst the royals, because these royals are actually hereditary within the 11 hereditary chiefs, but pick one who shall be negotiating with. We see that being reflected in the form of the first individual, Semei Kakongu, and then of course eventually into the likes of Ezekiel T. Wako, up to the present Kyabazinga. So Kyabazingaship is simply a collection of those individual royals, yes, who come together and elect an individual. Elect. Now they elect on the basis of what? Serving whose interest? The colonial master. So even the dilemma that we have today in Busoga, for example, the inability of these different chiefs to have consensus addendum in light of an individual are premised on the fact that they are their own kings in right. And that understanding should sink deep amongst the people of Busoga, because they should understand that much as they are crying or rejoicing over this entity called the Kyabazingaship, it is simply a creation of the colonial master. The colonial master who actually wants to have an individual for purposes of organization, administrative aspects. And that's what happened. That's what happened in almost every area where the colonials were actually involving. They simply wanted, how do we get individuals just within their setup, but who can help us to be able to do our own things. So we see for the fact that for the first time, by virtue of the National Agreement and other agreements, a subjugation of authority and a usurpation of authority from these individuals who are rightly, having that authority, but now surrendered to this machinery called the colonial machinery. And so no wonder when we see when these chiefs are called or summoned and given, perhaps the kings, let me use the word rightly, the kings, not chiefs, the kings, the king of Busoga, for example, in the names of the Kyabazinga, the king of Uganda and the Toro and Bunyoro call them, yeah? When they are called and they are given cars, for example, by the entity, by the head of the state, he is simply exercising what he knows best, which he inherited because of that usurpation of authority by virtue of the 1900 agreement. So we need to understand, people need to contextualize this debate, that for you to begin making noise against a head of state or against a head of a republic, you must understand the history, the constitutional history that brought into these factors and why they matter. So in that book, Exhausting the Inexhaustible Uganda Ghost, Hoodwinked, Dumped, Used and Dumped, by Isaac Christopher Lubogo, he makes this proposition that could it be that the people of Buganda were given Byoya Byanswa? Could it be that the people of Busoga should understand that this so-called prized animal of Kyabazingaship is simply an extension of a colonial interest that was now used for purposes of managing the people of Busoga? That is important for them to understand. So the debate of constitutionalism in terms of how it navigates into the history of this country has a lot of bearing in light of what has transpired before. And that is something that is important for you to understand. So you can be quick to victimize or perhaps to condemn any authority, but without you analyzing the things that surround these constitutional debates in terms of the Lancaster, in terms of the Marlborough, in terms of the 1900, in terms of the constitution that has been prevailing over a period of time, it's important for you to navigate. Perhaps another book I need you to look at is the book called The Executive Mandate. The Executive Mandates, Constitutional Executive Mandates, by Isaac Christopher Lubogo, where he makes those propositions. So the challenge, the dilemma that our country has in light of understanding, no wonder the Constitution actually lays bare these provisions, the authorities that are given to these cultural leaders. In fact, it refers to them as ceremonial, without substantive authority. So who then makes the king? Who then makes the king? Is it the people? By virtue of the fact that yes, this is called them inborn and inherited, because here is a Murangira who probably will become a king, and therefore their son becomes a king eventually. Still, that is subject to the bigger king, and the bigger king becomes who? The head of the state. So for you who seem to have issues, you need to understand constitutional law in this context. That the bigger king, unfortunately, becomes who? The colonial agent. That colonial agent was who? The head of state. No wonder we refer to them as His Royal Highness, as opposed to Your Majesty. As opposed to Your Majesty the Queen. As opposed to Your Majesty the King. You know? So, we refer to them in that context. So we need to understand, for you to understand the dilemmas of the blending is the white man or the colonial masters, the interest has never been in the interest of you. It has been the interest of, can I have a system that I can manage? I will play within their games, you know, and be able to manage. No wonder an individual called Lord Berkeley, I think, way back in 1884, in the House of Parliament in England, said this very statement, that how do you expect for us to conquer or subjugate a people unless we tell them that their language is wrong, their food is not right, their culture is wrong, and give them our own ways of looking at things. If they accept our own ways, then they will know that truly what was theirs is actually wrong, and they will fight it. So one of the things are debatable in the context of constitutional analysis, but you have to understand them in the context of where the history begins, because the history informs the future. So you cannot look at the future without understanding what transpired way back in terms of the constitutional dispensation of this country. That is just a simple debate in terms of my analysis of the dilemma between the Republic as head of state vis-a-vis these individuals who rightly take these positions as kings, or perhaps stooges of the central government. You know, and I say that with a lot of remorse. Why? Because at the end of the day, even the state today inherited a legacy, a colonial legacy, and so you cannot do much out of that. You cannot outdo when you actually sold your birthright at that particular time. You sold your birthright, and that's the challenge that we have today. Perhaps we have to rebrand in terms of how we refer to them. Perhaps we have to have African renaissance in terms of ideological dispensation of some of these aspects. You know, it's time. You look at countries like Nigeria, where they came up with amalgamation of different entities and merged them together. Talk about Cameroon, you know, talk about Nigeria, talk about Kenya. So all the challenges that Africa may have today is the failure for you to understand that these things were orchestrated at a certain time, you know, and we need to understand, if you are to go forward, how do we, first of all, understand? And using the word understand perhaps is a wrong phrase, because understand is understanding, but perhaps you need to overstand rather than understand, because when you understand, you're actually limiting yourself to that kind of ideology. So we need to understand in the context of overstanding how these things will inform us and why we are the way we are and what we need to do. It becomes extremely important. That is my discussion. Thank you very much.